Welcome to this TEPSA Book Launch, Security, Defense, and the Future of Europe, Views from the Capitals. This book, which is edited by Michael Kading, Johannes Pollack, and Paul Schmidt, brings together the analysis of 42 national positions, 42 national views on Europe's security architecture and threat perceptions. The conclusion is not very surprising. Given their history and national context, threat perceptions, defense readiness, and the willingness to invest in defense differ. But as the Commissioner Kubilius wrote in the foreword of the book, these contributions also show that what unites us is bigger than what divides us. I'd like to thank Commissioner Andrius Kubilius wholeheartedly for his lucid foreword to the book and for really advancing these very concrete proposals on how EU member states and important non-EU partners can operate on a continental scale with less fragmentation, more interoperability, and more institutional readiness to defend Europe. I'd also very much like to thank all our distinguished panelists. I'm sorry to say that Monica Sus could not make it because of the strike at the Brussels airport, which was unannounced previously. So the gender imbalance was actually not planned. And I'd like to introduce Tyyne Karjalainen from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, who will make an excellent moderator to this debate. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Great to see you all here. I actually want to start from the context, which is that when the European Union established its foreign security and defense policies and instruments for these policies in late 1990s and early 2000s, we were living in a very different Europe. It was a time when Europe believed that wars had ended. It was a kind of moment of end of history marked by the idea of spreading democracy and no longer interstates wars in Europe. The European security rested on two pillars, the unipolar moment of the US and US as the guarantor of multilateral order, also on the European continent, on one hand, and on the other hand also on the idea of cooperative security with Russia. So the idea that through agreements, formats such as the OSCE, through trade, we could actually keep peace and build security together with Russia. 20 years later, we have a very different Europe. And this means that, of course, the instruments and policies of the European Union don't anymore match the context. The United States is no longer trusted as the guarantor of multilateral order on the European continent. NATO is facing a historic crisis, and Russia has started a war on the European continent. In this context, the European Union has taken the historic task to build European self-sufficient defense. But is the European Union up to the task? This is a question that I don't need to answer today, but I have here indeed Commissioner Kubilius, also a former member of the European Parliament and former Prime Minister of Lithuania. I also have here Professor Daniel Fiott, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit, Brussels, where he heads the Defense and Statecraft program. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid. Thank you so much for joining me here today. We'll start with Commissioner. You have written the foreword for this book. And in this foreword, you mentioned the need for a genuine defense union. This is a very different idea than the European Union was given, or the mandate that the EU got when it was established. The EU's original mandate as an international actor was something to deal with peace, right, and perhaps international intervention. When you compare the European Union as it stands today With your vision of the defense union, what is lacking? What kind of instruments, strategies, policies, resources do we need for the European Union, for your vision of a defense union to materialize?
Technological question. Maybe I need to push something, yeah. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot. Good evening to everybody, and thanks a lot for, first of all, for the book. But second, of course, for this very good discussion in such a nice atmosphere, which immediately brings some kind of historical approach to your questions. And I will start reminding that when European community was started to be created with coal and steel, and atom unity. At the same time, those godfathers of our European Union, like Jean Monnet, like Schuman, like Adenauer, were pushing creation of European defense community. You know the story, Pleven Plan, French Prime Minister, then it failed again in France. So that's I think is really quite a historical, how to say, not mistake, but misfortune for Europe, that at that time, it did not materialize. Now we are looking into European Defense Union. So if you look very verbally, you know that community was used, the word community was used till 1990, then it was changed into union. So when now we are creating, we're speaking about European Defense Union, and this is not my idea. I have in my mission letter written, task to work on that. So we are talking more or less about, again, the same historical, idea of European defense community in different form, in different, realities, but that's what is the task. Now, what, is in general, what is the goal? Especially when we are looking at, well, our transatlantic partners perhaps have all the rational arguments to start to diminish their presence here, then definitely our goal is to become stronger. That's, in general. On one side we have Russia, on another side we have Iran, Americans are leaving, so our wish is to become stronger. I'm always asking very, provocative but very simple question. In your opinion, if United States now would decide to have, instead of one federal army, one, defense policy, and one defense budget, to have 50, armies, policies, and budgets for defense on the level of states, would the United States become stronger or weaker? Perhaps the answer is very clear. That the United States would become weaker from military point of view. We have 27 armies, 27 budgets, 27 defense policies, and I don't want to say that, we are weak, but we have progress, what we can do. And in my view, exactly European Defense Union is in some way, the instrument which would allow us to become more united. I am not saying that, total unity should be created, but more united. And that has a lot of, goals why we need to become united. Because when we are talking about European defense readiness 2030, Russia can start aggression against us, you know all that, motivation why we need to have defense readiness. I'm always repeating that in order to have defense readiness 2030, we need to see that defense readiness has 3 pillars. One is material defense readiness, weapons, production, procurement, money, and so on. Second is institutional defense readiness, how we are organizing ourselves, how we can become more united, how we are creating European pillar of NATO, and things like that. And the last one is political defense readiness, how we are keeping our political will, not allowing Kremlin with all its hybrid means to divide us, to destroy public support for defense, and so on and so on. So that is where, really we need to understand that all those 3 pillars are very much interconnected among themselves. For example, to create air defense shield for the whole Europe. You know, Israel has Iron Dome, Americans are creating Golden Dome. Well, we don't want, you know, to be so. We shall not talk about Diamond Dome. Maybe it will be enough of European Dome. Let's say so. To create such kind of big pan-European project with European defense policies very much fragmented, with defense industry very much fragmented, I am not saying impossible, but it demands a really much stronger institutional readiness, and I would call much stronger possibility to have also top-down influence, not only bottom-up, you know, which comes from the member states, but also top-down approach to coordinate, to lead, to agree among most important players on the European continent, how we are going to do it, how we are going to develop. For example, I will try to stop very soon, but you know, I'm an experienced politician. It will not be so easy. So recently, German experts from Kiel Institute, from so-called group Sparta 2.0, perhaps they call themselves so, published a very interesting paper, very important paper on so-called strategic enablers. What Europe needs to build, besides, you know, air defense shield, space, different, you know, strategic enablers. If Americans are leaving, we need to be ready to replace all those strategic enablers which now are provided by the United States. They calculated that we can do that during the next 5 up to 10 years. It will cost 500 billion. So from one side, it looks like very huge amount of money. Definitely, it's, again, absolutely clear that from next MFF, we shall not have such an amount of money. It would be good if we would have for defense around of 70 billion. But member states, if they will fulfill their pledges to increase their defense spending up to 3.5%, they will spend during the next 10 years almost 7 trillion euros. So money in general are here, theoretically are here. Now, to make them practically, we need to find a way how to bring member states all together and to share their national defense spending for those big projects. So that is why this top-down approach is very much needed, and that is why I started to talk also about a European Security Council. On Saturday, there was a very interesting article in Financial Times, and I see exactly possibility through European Defence Union also to create this new, high-level political body to coordinate our policies through European Security Council. So that is, in my view, exactly what is missing and what we need to do, and I will stop perhaps here.
Thank you. Let me be now a bit provocative, because, I also come from a frontline country myself, and we cannot trust a union, a defense union that only exists on paper, right? So I'll actually ask one follow-up question from you, Commissioner for Defense, because I would like to understand to what extent this defense union that you just described actually exists. So if 0 means that it is still completely operational, and 10 means that we already have a European defense union, where are we actually right now?
I'm always lost in those evaluations, Well, I would say, yeah, we are less than 5. We are doing, as European Union, we're doing a lot. Now, really, during last years, financial, what I call big bang really starting to appear. But from another side, we can see very clearly, for example, because we miss single defense market, we see the problems, how much and how our industries are able to adapt, to scale up, how we can really, create a space for startups and mid-caps in order to modernize our defense industry. And our defense industry is very much concentrated on what they call themselves haute couture production, very, very sophisticated technologically, but very, very expensive, very, very difficult to ramp up. Until now, Russia is quite heavily outproducing us. And this is really dangerous. So that's why I'm saying that we are less than 5.
Thank you for the clear assessment. Professor Fiott, in this book, TEPSA's book, Karlis Bukovskis and Yanis Starts do suggest that for the sake of simplification and coherence, we should integrate European Defence Agency, PESCO, so the Permanent Structures Cooperation, and European Defence Fund under a single framework chaired by the Commissioner for Defence. Now, in your research, you have highlighted the remaining limits of integration in EU defence, and you find this policy sector as strongly intergovernmental. So, to what extent is this balancing between intergovernmentalism and supranationalism, more institutions, more integrated institutions, is this what the problems and solutions are about? So, to what extent are the shortcomings of European defence actually linked to these institutional arrangements? And if so, how do you see the way forward for more integration?
Yeah, thanks very much. And first of all, thanks for the invitation to speak here also alongside the Commissioner. And I guess that question of, putting different institutional or different agencies under the Commissioner's control or purview, we should probably ask him first if he wants to give up his weekends and evenings as much as he already does. But to give it a serious answer, I think, look, anybody who has been looking at the institutional landscape today in Europe, at least for the last 10 years, let's say, have seen, I would say, a rapid development coalescing around the European Commission and the European Council. These two bodies in particular, I think, are absolutely critical to EU integration more generally, but specifically on defence. There was a time, and I myself also wrote papers on this, where one could maybe consider a situation where the Commission was considered a rival by other bodies and institutions. And the paper I wrote was on the European Defence Agency, and I guess to some degree you could also add the External Action Service.
Some still do, maybe, I think.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I think in a way it's a bit of a phony debate now, in the sense that this question of rivalry, and if I had to write the paper again, I would certainly not use the word rivalry. I mean, what we see very clearly is that when member states feel like there's a lot of pressure to be brave and to be taken out of their comfort zone on defence, it's probably automatic for them to feel some comfort in intergovernmental bodies, right? So that's why when recently the European Commission was extremely brave and forward-thinking in its white paper, you immediately got signals from certain capitals saying, oh, we should reinvest in the EDA, or we should reinvest in the EAS. This to me is a bit of a category error judgment, but it's an understandable one by the member states. They go where their comfort zone is. I think, however, the reality is that that was part of a transitional politics. Today, with the money that's on the table, with the initiatives that are on the table by the Commission, and what will come in the future, by the way, with the European Defence Industrial Programme. I'm not talking about the 1.5 billion today, but Commissioner already mentioned 70 billion, SAFE on top of this, etc., etc. There's more money, but it also means that the Commission becomes a central actor, working very much closely with the European Council, I think. Now, I agree with the Commissioner, and actually maybe I would go a bit further, that what is lacking today is bravery from the member states themselves. It's very clear to anyone looking at European defence that the Commission, from a legal perspective, regardless of what ambitions there may be behind the walls, from a legal perspective, cannot be the only defence actor. So when we talk of a top-down governance from the Commission, we have to be slightly careful with that. We do need more top-down ambition, for sure, but it will always be in partnership with the member states. Now, that's the Commission side, but the member states have a huge responsibility because they're also living in a period of history now where intergovernmental squabbles, arguments, are really not up to the standard of what we need actually in Europe. You know, You will remember maybe Lord Ismay's comments when NATO was created, you know. What was the purpose of NATO? To keep Russia out, Germans down, and Americans in. Well, the Russia side still definitely counts to keep Russia out. The Germany down, not so sure anymore. Actually, we want Europeans up. We need them to be much more defensive, strong, etc. The Americans is the open question. And I actually think that much of the hesitation that comes from member states and much of the, let's say, political signaling that comes from many capitals of the Commission is doing a power grab, etc., that is actually a symptom of the fear that they have of being left alone by the United States. So actually the single question of security in Europe today is, yes, Russia, very important, but you cannot divorce the Russia question from the America question. And this is where I think member states have really struggled in many cases to make a distinction. They tend to think that more European integration is, let's say, against their interests in this. I think the opposite is true. Another point here, which is that the influx of money in the defense sector is absolutely important. But I will say something, which is that the pressure that most governments have today as well is not the pressure to spend it today, although that's a big challenge. The question is, how will they sustain public interest in defense spending in the next 5-10 years? Because keeping the public on side for defense is going to be really critical, especially in those member states that are not on the front line with Russia. This is a really important point because it means that our arguments in support of defense need to become a lot better than they are today. What do I mean by this? Very clearly, if you're on the front line with Russia, you don't need convincing of what the threat is. But what about those other member states who don't quite feel the pressure? Maybe the argument for them is not necessarily, Russian parachutists coming in. Maybe the argument for them is to invest in defense for the benefit of economic competitiveness, for example. So we have to be very careful with how we frame the argument on defense investment overall. So I think the member states themselves are caught in a little bit of an intergovernmental trap. However, let me not be a complete pessimist as well, by the way, because even a short detour in recent history, and for those that saw the creation and birth of the European Defence Fund, some critics might say with 8 billion, that really didn't change much, but it did. It was a huge change in the way the European defence architecture is set up. Not necessarily because we could use money from the EU budget, which, by the way, today is now the norm, it seems, but more the political side, which is that for all of the rhetoric of not trusting the Commission, of not trusting institutions, they still wanted a slice of the pie in the EDF. They still sat around the table on work programs on the EDF committees. They will do the same under the EDIP, because the costs of not doing so, are too high. So I would make also a distinction between the rhetoric, which is probably designed for domestic audiences, and the real core interest in value. And I will end on what the Commissioner said as well. I'm not sure if it was Benjamin Franklin to coin that great man. He said, it's rather obvious for us today, you either hang together or you're hanged separately. And we're really in that historical moment in Europe at the moment. Let me be very frank, no one cares about the Europeans more than we do. The Americans are looking elsewhere. We as Europeans do not get a vote in the American elections. We never will. So we better start getting our act together.
Thank you. Actually, a follow-up. I think something that you mentioned about the European Defence Fund really catched my eye, because are you suggesting, or do you mean that, or are you referring to this kind of political and economic cost of opting out, that while some member states don't perhaps believe in EU defence policies and structures, and perhaps indeed believe that more European defence means less US in Europe, if we establish new policies and instruments that are credible, even these member states will feel the pressure to be part. There is this kind of fear of missing out there.
Yeah, this is where the supranational intergovernmental logic falls down a bit, because if you look at EDIP, you can have an interpretation that, some great people in the Commission sat down and wrote it and then everyone accepted it. It's not the case. It's always a negotiation. So whatever legislation you come up with in the defence industrial sector already has the implicit stamp of approval from the Council and the Member States. So again, I would make a difference between the rhetorical side that we hear very often, and probably more so now, and the reality, which is that for most governments, they cannot afford not to be locked in into European initiatives on defense industry. It's really got to a stage where it has become incredibly important for their defense sector. Now, it's also true, and we must acknowledge that not all member states are created equally. I mean, one could make a case for saying the small and medium-sized states have much more of a vested interest in getting a slice of the pie from all of this investment. But I would say it also matters for the big member states as well. Because if they don't step out now on creating European solutions on all of the capabilities, by the way, that we lack, they will find that the market will be dominated by those from outside of Europe in the years ahead. So they have a fundamental economic interest to invest in these capabilities now. Forget the defense interest, because there's a strong one, but purely even from an economic one, they cannot afford to miss this bus at all.
Thank you, super interesting. Now, let's turn to Ukraine. Commissioner, in the foreword, you emphasized the importance of integrating Ukraine into the European security architecture. This is very much shared, of course, in EU capitals, which understand that Ukraine is a security contributor already now in not only the defense industrial market, but very concretely fighting our shared aggressor or main national threat. Yet, this current war prevents Ukraine's accession in the European Union and perhaps even integration in some formats. So my question is, which steps of integrating Ukraine into European defense policies can take place now during the hot phase of the war, and which will need to wait for the war to be over?
Well, thanks a lot. I think that this is really one of the most important questions, looking from defense point of view. But I will start coming a little bit back, but using exactly, and then I will return to Ukraine. Recently, first of all, Commission President, I was really surprised by her speech to Ambassadors Conference. And recently I saw that German Foreign Affairs Minister Johann Wadepool was speaking very similar language, that we need to answer, are our institutions, no, Commission President, she started, are our, let's say, strategies, institutions, and decision-making, are they fit for, for this time which we're facing now? And answer was not given, but from that question you could understand that on all of those three, doctrines, institutions, and decision-making, really, we have a problem with what we inherited from the peacetime. So that is why we need to look for answers, and including answers for Ukraine. And why we need that answer? Because of very practical needs. Recently Marco Rubio said Ukrainian army is the best and strongest in Europe. Alex Stubb, Finnish president, added even that perhaps it's the best in the world. I don't know if Americans agree with that, but on Europe I would really agree, with such kind of evaluation. So then really we need to understand what we need really to do. If we have on the European continent next to us the best army in Europe, and our intelligence services are saying that Russia can decide, we don't know when, very soon, to test Article 5 with new aggression against EU or NATO member states, Baltics, Poland, Finland, whatever. I am always saying that, look, in that case, again, we need to see, with a very clear eyes, what we shall face. We shall face a Russian battle-tested army. Okay, it's not so successful in Ukraine, but nevertheless, it's stronger than it was back in 2022. And we know that they can use, last year they were using around 5 million drones, and that can come into our direction. And I'm always asking for a simple question. Do we have such an experience, to defend ourselves against such possible aggression by battle-tested Russian army? My answer is quite skeptical. I know our countries in the region, we are not able to detect one drone, so not talking about millions of drones. So then, we have what we need to understand. We have on the European continent, Ukrainian army, which has capability, which has battle-tested, military forces, and which has battle-tested industry. So for us not to look how to integrate both army and industry would be a big mistake. Now, as you said, really the question is how we can do that, even during the war. Definitely, NATO membership is not agreed. European Union membership, again, what we can hear from some capitals, it can take a longer time. The other is European Defence Union, which should unite not only EU member states, but European member states, which can bring a lot of added value to our common defense, like United Kingdom, like Norway, including Ukraine. We can have some kind of transition period protocols, in order not to put the member states in such a situation that they will need to think, oh, now we shall need to go to defend Ukraine. That can be resolved. But for us, integration of Ukrainian battle-tested experience or industry, which managed to grow up by 50 times since the beginning of the war, from 1 billion euros production in 2022 up to 50 billion last year. I would remind that this is the same amount what the whole German industry is able to produce, or French industry is able to produce. And they are producing exactly, innovative weapon systems, which are really also influencing very much defense doctrine and so on. So for us, that would be very, very, very strategically important. And that is why we need to go into that direction. So we have a lot of new instruments, where especially on the industrial side, we're trying to integrate, to create platforms, how we can learn from Ukraine. That is something new for us. Till now we always were talking about how much we're supporting Ukraine and what additional funds we can bring. Now we have this Ukrainian support loan, very important. But now we are talking also very much how Ukraine can help us. So that is what is the future. And I see really that we shall, with all the different initiatives, like where Ukraine can participate in DPCIs with EDIP, with European Defence Project of Common Interest, Drone Alliance, now drone deals coming also. So I see that really very important movement forward, which I hope at the end will create very clear understanding among us, among Europeans, that Ukrainian integration into EU in general is vital interest of us. It's not just that we are, giving some kind of gift to Ukrainians. No, it's vital interest for us, and especially because of all those security and defense issues.
Thank you for being so clear, because obviously this is not how the European thinking was before the full-scale war. If we look into how Ukraine was integrated in the European security and defense structures before 2022, it was non-existent. Not only the EU door was closed and the NATO door was closed, also the military cooperation, bilateral military cooperation between European capitals and Ukraine was almost non-existent. One of the most tangible formats was actually the Lithuanian Polish Ukrainian Brigade, which tells something about how non-existent it was, right? Now, I have one more question to Professor Fiott, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience, so you can already prepare. In this TEPSA's book, Oleksiy Melnik and Mykolai Sunguvrovsky from Ukraine identify Russia as a primary and long-term threat to Europe. And actually, Commissioner in his foreword mentioned that Russia could test NATO by 2030. So there is quite short timeline. You refer to some intelligence sources there. Now, Professor Fiott, do you think that Europe can make it in time? Do you think that Europe can build the sufficient defense capabilities? And like in particular, what are the critical gaps that we now should address? And I'm thinking also about strategic dependencies. Which strategic dependencies we should focus on right now to make it in time? And are there some strategic dependencies or some dependencies that we just can't do anything about?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think that's a really set of important questions. I mean, let me first say that I agree with the assessment that Russia is the primary threat for Europe moving forward. It's not the only one, obviously, but it is the primary one. What I might say as well is that Russia is already testing us. You know, when you have drones landing in Romania and Poland, elsewhere, I mean, this is a test. If you look at the shadow fleets that are popping up everywhere in Europe, France the other day, of course, monitoring and dissuading another one, they are testing us already. And they're testing us very clearly for many reasons, but two of the principal ones is that firstly, they know we're not as ready as we should be. That's the first thing. And secondly, they want to test our alliance with the US. For Russia, if you're looking from Russian eyes to Europe, this is how you test Europe. You test us on our resolve, you test us on our partnership or alliance with the United States, and you keep testing. So this threat will be there for many years to come. There are many reports saying, there is internal, turmoil in the Kremlin, etc. We've had these reports for many years already. What we should do, of course, is develop, as the question implies, the capabilities that would help deter Russia. Now, another story on the Russian front, which we shouldn't forget, of course, is it's not just Russia. It was Russia-Iran. There's a question there for the future, whether Iran will re-emerge as a military supplier to the Russian economy in the future after this current situation. There's the Chinese. I mean, we're in an Oriental-themed room. I guess I should mention China at least once. And on top of that, North Korea. So the Russians are not really alone. We need to be careful of that for the coming years. Now, in terms of capabilities, this is one of the debates which I really worry about because, of course, we have a lot more money. But we don't have all of that money being directed in common projects. Now, some time ago, and I think the Commissioner can say more about this, there was a proposal for certain common defense projects, on space, on drones, on air shields, etc. All of that is fine, and that is absolutely needed. Actually, I don't have anything to add on what is already in the white paper and the roadmap. I think very clearly those capability areas are critically important. Now, whether we will be ready in time, we don't really have a choice. We have to be ready. That's the first point to make. The second point is that I still feel as if we have not taken the potential for the US to leave us really behind seriously enough. So on all of the capability areas that we clearly need, especially on air defense, etc., all is good. But what about command and control, for example? This is one area that we fully rely on the US for, but at the click of a finger, they could say no more. This would have a hugely disruptive effect on our conventional defense and the relationship with nuclear defense, by the way, and nuclear deterrence. So I am not sure that every capital knows how high the stakes are, or if they do, they might be caught in a trap where they don't necessarily want to be the first ones to go first and say, we really have to plan for life without the Americans. So they're waiting again for Washington to give the final word on this, as opposed to getting moving now. This is what I really worry about, because it could be that in the next 5-10 years, we actually do make really good on long-range strike, air defense, drones, all of this, we could make good. But what if we don't have the nervous system, the central nervous system of command and control? If we did not invest in that in the last few years, I'm afraid everything else we invest in becomes not meaningless, but it becomes much more difficult for Europeans to act as a coherent defensive actor. And coming back to the original point, acting as a cohesive technological, industrial and defense actor is the only thing that will really deter the Russians. If they know they cannot put a sheet of paper between us, that is when we know we have succeeded.
Right. I'm afraid there are still some sheets of paper remaining that we need to remove. Now I'm turning to the audience. Are there any questions or comments? Please raise your hand and we'll have a microphone going forward. I think there is one in the middle.
Thank you. Stefania Benaglia, Foreign Policy Advisor. Picking up exactly on the discussion that has been on the institutional readiness, I like to rephrase the famous call, whom should I call to call the EU, in who makes the call when it comes to institutional readiness. If there's one danger that I see is the bureaucratization of the call. So in defense, of course, timing is of essence. How do you avoid the danger that we will find ourselves in the short future, where the decisions on defense, once the European Defense Union is formed and is happening, are bureaucratized to a level that are ineffective?
Thank you. We can take a few questions and then we come back to the speakers. Any other questions or comments?
Good evening, I'm Vincent Laborderie from UC Louvain. I have a question to Mr. Commissioner Kubilius. You mentioned at the moment a phrase which was European Defence Alliance, which Ukraine could be part of in the future. And I would like just you to explain what you think when you mention it, and if it's something which is inside European Union as it is today or something else.
Thank you so much. Any more questions or comments in the mid?
Nikola Ražnatović from the Mission of Montenegro. My question is, we are all aware that the red line for Russia was accession of Ukraine to NATO. And do you think that this could replicate to the potential accession of Ukraine to the European Defense Union? And do you think that it could be casus belli for armed conflict between European Defense Union and Ukraine and the Russian Federation?
Thank you. Are there any more questions or comments? I would like to actually add one myself. Professor Fiott, you mentioned this need for command and planning capabilities in Europe. Do you mean that these capabilities should exist within the European Union or within NATO? And is the original division of labor between these two organizations, as it is right now, is it still up to date? You can pick and choose which questions and comments you want to answer, and maybe we can start from Professor this time.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think if you're developing capabilities even in common, you're setting up an industrial and cooperative structure. The member states choose where to use those capabilities. It can be on a national basis, can be in NATO, it can be in the EU. I think the important thing to keep in mind is not necessarily to put the organization of use first, but what's really important is the flexibility of use. And what I mean by this is that if you look at the initiatives to develop common defense projects, let me say something really provocative now, you have to try and make them as ITAR-free as possible. And what does this mean? No interference. If a European state or group of states decide to use or export a technology or weapon system in the way they want, they should not be stopped from doing that. Now, you could argue that we have enough export blockages and regulations within Europe, and I think that's a fair point. But what we should not have is any extraterritorial jurisdiction over how we use and develop our capabilities. Without that freedom of operation and maneuver and use, we don't have autonomy at all. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. If you have those autonomous capabilities and the industrial depth behind it, then you choose where best to put those capabilities. Now, I think there is a longer discussion to be had. We don't have time for it. But I think there's a longer discussion to be had about what is the principal organization through which we will discuss military issues, because the EU is not prepared for it yet, still. And I have another comment on this in response to one of the questions. But NATO is not in a healthy situation right now. Some take comfort from the fact that Sakur is still American. We could run the experiments of what that would look like if he wasn't American. Which European would take it? How would they argue over it? How long would it last? How credible, etc., etc. We have a real problem of knowing what the institutional, to coin what Clausewitz said, where is the center of gravity of our military force? This is a real question, and it ties in with the institutional question. On the EU front, look, the EU is still not used to thinking as a military actor for various reasons, historical legacy, but also the way the treaties are structured. For those that want to make the argument that the EU should not be a defense actor, there's actually a lot in the treaty if you want to argue that. But I would say there's an equal, if not more, amount in the treaty that we need to test more. And we need to be brave in testing it. I'm always shocked that we've not taken in the EU more of a progressive and brave stance on Article 42.7, which on paper is stronger than Article 5 in the Washington Treaty, but we have nothing behind it. It's not taken seriously today. Why is it not taken seriously today? In the future, I believe it should be taken seriously. By the way, a final point on this as well. If you ask the Ukrainians as well, do they think 42.7 is credible today? So does that, it's a way of saying, is there a credible security guarantee? In public, they may say, yeah, of course, of course. But everyone knows, even Europeans know, that we don't have anything behind 42.7. So on the point of not who do you call, because I agree with you, that's how you should frame it. It's not necessarily who picks up the phone, it's who decides what the next action is. Use 42.7 even as a test bed to see who would make the decisions in that regard. We've not even done that. That's the state of us today in the EU.
Thank you for raising also Ukrainian point of view in the Article 42.7. I think that's very topical, and when we discuss Ukraine's accession, we are actually also discussing what that article means, right? Like, what are we bound to with that article, right? And Ukrainians, of course, have very good reasons to doubt any security guarantees that are given to them at the moment. Commissioner, please.
We are diving so deeply into uncharted waters that we can spend the whole night here, discussing. And that is the reason why I was always saying that we need to have this European Security Council of, E5 countries plus, several rotational members, in order to try to find, what I call big answers to big questions, and then to have, possibility really to make decisions in some cases when they are needed, on all the different issues. So on 42.7, I would say we are working. I don't know what we shall bring, but we are working, and we need to, how to say, sometimes we are mystifying a little bit. What does it mean? First of all, we need to understand that 42.7 is about two, areas of mutual assistance: civilian one and military one. On civilian side, as European Union, I was quite surprised looking through how much we have developed, institutional and assistance mechanisms and so on and so on. And as former Prime Minister, I was saying to myself, it would be good to have on table, some kind of handbook in the case of such, day X, to look, immediately to know whom to call and what to do. Second question, of course, is, military assistance, how it can be done. And here questions are again of two types. If NATO Article 5 is invoked, then definitely EU has, almost nothing to do. The question is, of course, much more important if Article 5 is not invoked, for the countries which are not members of NATO, or if NATO is not doing, not able to reach an agreement. So in that case, definitely, what is important, and in my view, it's important really that we should have not only operationalization of Article 42.7, but we should have some kind of preparedness for Article 42.7 in advance, in order for member states really to be ready if one member state is feeling that, clouds are becoming darker, and they are asking, some kind of preparedness stage to be invoked, like NATO Article 4. Other countries are starting to look what kind of assistance they should provide. And second point, what is important, is really to have possibility to coordinate that assistance. Not to leave Prime Minister of the country which is attacked alone to call others and to say, can you give me, whatever, one artillery piece or something like that. So I see that as possible to develop. It does not mean that we need to develop some kind of new legal language. We can do that. What is interesting in addition to that, since Article 42.7 was mentioned here, I would turn your attention to what German Chancellor spoke, both what he proposed for Ukraine in his proposals about associative integration, whatever, association membership or something like that. He spoke also, and for me it was most interesting point, that here could be an offer for Ukraine to have this, Article 42.7, possibility to use that article. And it's interesting, not just because, for time being, 42.7 maybe does not look very strongly. But we should remember what Chancellor spoke during Munich Security Conference, where he said that European pillar of NATO should be built around Article 42.7. And for me, that is quite interesting to look strategically what does it mean, both for Article 42.7, for European pillar of NATO, and for Ukrainian, and proposal for Ukraine. So that's one thing. Now, really, I'm coming down to the questions, whom to call and how to call. Again, I see that, really, and agree with my colleague, really, we need to understand what is changing and what we shall have a deficit. If Americans are diminishing their role here in Europe, we shall really miss that informal leadership, which Americans were providing. And we need to fill that gap. And this is not when I'm talking about top-down, it's not about Commission. Commission will not play that role. That is why I'm again and again talking about this Security Council, which I would remind, it's not my invention. It was a topic which was started to be spoken out by President Macron back in 2018. It was supported by Angela Merkel at the time. Now I see the need really to find a way how we can have some kind of this collective political will to be established, to be coordinated, because my experience of the first year in Defense Council is very clear. It's not that body which can, which can lead. So that's for sure. So that's why I see, and I see really that in some way, informally, things are moving into that direction. We have this E5 plus format, which can play, a really important role. We have coalition of willing. What we need to a little bit to formalize that, and to have much more, clear procedures how it can work. Now, it was quite difficult to hear the proper questions on EU and Ukraine. I see very clearly, European Defence Union is not replacing NATO. NATO will stay as it is. It can have, European pillar of NATO strengthening itself, and somebody is talking about, again, about Europeization of NATO headquarters. Maybe that is an answer for this, question about control and command structures. Well, it's again, for those, Security Council to decide how it will go. So it's not replacement of NATO, it's not replacement of EU, but it's something, in addition to that. And the question, of course, how we shall go, both with the European Defence Union and with Security Council, because there are some lawyers are saying, well, we can use existing mechanisms of European Union treaty, but others are saying, well, in that case, we shall have, the issue how we can include non-EU members, like Great Britain or Norway or Ukraine. That is why another option is to look for possibility of new intergovernmental treaty, where Ukraine can participate on equal basis. And the last question, well, it was really very difficult to understand. Again, if we are looking what kind of added value we can bring now for Ukraine, in my view, even not waiting for European Defence Union, we need to change our how to say, background philosophy of our assistance. I'm always becoming, how to say, a little bit nervous, keeping calm but nervous inside, when we're saying that we shall support Ukraine as long as it takes. For me, it means that we are supporting survival of Ukraine. Now Ukraine started to prevail. In my view, it would be much better for us to start to speak that we shall support Ukraine to prevail in such a way to push Putin for negotiations on a just peace for Ukraine. So that is the first task. Second, of course, and then we need Ukrainian integration because this is our vital interest. And integration into European Defence Union would be the first step for full integration into single market, into the whole European Union. It will take time, but the European Defence Union can be some kind of stepping stone on that road.
Thank you for ending there. I think that's very important that we move indeed from helping Ukraine to continue this war to helping Ukraine to end this war by disintensifying Russia to continue its war of aggression. I think we have clarified the pathway towards European Defence Union here. We have agreed that we already have the plans and instruments in the white paper especially, and now it's about actually implementing them. However, the member states, of course, don't agree on all of the issues, and I think that TEPSA's book is a great guide for understanding what are the politics behind these policies, and also on what issues the member states still need to find themselves on the same page. Now it's time to thank the speakers. Thank you so much for joining this session, and then it's time to conclude.